Star is Born segment here on The Last Word. Anat Shenker-Osorio earned a standing ovation from me that I could not give her because, as I said, the control room was in my ear, insisting that we go to a commercial after each. She explained to us why pre-existing notions about politics and political parties prevent some voters from hearing what Democrats are saying about the policies they are trying to enact in the Biden legislative agenda.
What I would say about that is that motivated cognition is a hell of a drug. And what I mean by that is that a more effective descriptor of the human cognitive processing system would be, I'll see it when I believe it, not the other way around. What we find in experiment after experiment is that when people have already cemented a worldview, they in essence have a frame around what is occurring, then facts are simply impervious to it. They bounce off of it, right? In lay terms, if you've ever had the experience of trying to tell one of your friends that the guy that she's dating is a complete and total jerk, and you provide her fact after fact after fact, and they are just going ping, 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 that's what I'm talking about, but spread across massive issues of social justice and economic well-being. And so people are incredibly adept at discounting factual information, at simply weeding it out, not paying attention to it, ignoring it, that doesn't fit their pre-existing frame. And so it's precisely as you said, if they have an existing storyline about quote unquote what Democrats do and how they behave, then facts are pretty much impervious to it. Now, rather than get very, very sad about that, because one could, but one still has to go on, we could recognize that we have to speak, as your previous guests were saying, in the language of values. And more than that, as I often like to tell people, don't take your policy out in public. It's unseemly. Messaging about policy is always less effective than what that policy delivers. So when we ask people, how do you feel about paid family leave? They're into it. When we say instead, you're there the first time your newborn smiles, they're way more into it. When we say raising wages, very popular. When we say instead, everyone makes enough to care for their family, way more popular. What Democrats need to do when they do have the mic is stop selling the recipe and start selling the brownie. Stop talking about the names of your policies and instead speak to voters in imageable terms about what it would feel like to have that as the reality in their life.
Joining us now, once again, is Anat Shenker-Osorio, the founder of ASO Communications and the host of my new favorite podcast that I haven't listened to yet, Words to Win By. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And, you know, the selling the brownie instead of the recipe is just such a perfect message. And it seems to me that what happens with politicians is the reporters are always asking them about the recipe, always about the recipe. And so they get kind of trained, you know, running down the hallways in the Senate and the House about answering questions about the recipe, and hearings are questions about the recipe. And it seems that they kind of just lose that ability to show you the brownie and just kind of glow about the brownie.
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. And it's funny, it's really not just lawmakers. When I give trainings and lectures to folks in advocacy, they will frequently tell me, yeah, that sounds great. That messaging seems really compelling. It sounds like the way real people talk, but I can't talk that way on the Hill. Or if I'm doing a training in California where I live, I can't talk that way in Sacramento. And my response to that, and I say this granted with no evidence, so I will admit that up front, lawmakers are people. I know, I don't have proof, but I'm going with that statement. And what I mean by that is that, like any other humans, they discern information and they filter it through a human brain, which means, like anyone else, they are creatures of identity, they are creatures of emotion. And yes, they've been taught to speak in this calcified language of policy, but in reality, we are not good arbiters of what actually moves us. We can only ever know what we think that we think, because the majority of thought is unconscious. And in fact, what we know through priming experimentation is that people will will tell us that it was a fact that moved them, but when we eliminate it or we manipulate the fact, it is indeed the emotional core of the message that actually is persuasive or not.
Yeah, and there's an incredible challenge in this because, and this thing we just did, the New York Times did a report, for example, about this Biden proposal with the IRS, and it allowed the reader to believe that the IRS will be monitoring their bank accounts, monitoring every transaction in their bank accounts if they have $600 or more in their bank account, which sounded absolutely insane. And it turns out it is insane. The Times was not communicating correctly about what's in it. And the Democrats had done no advanced work on combating what is happening to that particular proposal. It seems as though no one sat down and said, okay, how do we talk about this one? Because they've got 100 things they have to talk about in this thing. How do we explain this one? And so now they're trying to catch up to explain something that actually makes perfect sense when you hear about it.
Yeah, I don't pretend that any of this is unchallenging, but nature abhors a vacuum, and anytime we are not pumping in information, it is helping and it is allowing disinformation to proliferate, which of course is intentional and deliberate on the part of the other side. But unless there is some counter, politics isn't solitary. We don't exist in a world in which folks are just hearing from our side. That'd be lovely, but that's not reality. And so we have to recognize, just as you said, that anything that we're saying, we have to think through not just how are people going to understand it, but more specifically, what is it we want to say to people to get them to believe what we need them to believe and to do what we need them to do?
It seems, and you have to reach back pretty far, when policy was less complicated, that there was a time when politicians were better at this. And when I say that, I'm thinking of people like Bobby Kennedy, who didn't ever have detailed prescriptions, as a campaigner or as a politician. But that was at a time when government was far less complex than it is now.
Yeah, but even still, as many people have frequently remarked, Martin Luther King Jr. did not get famous for saying, I have a complaint, nor did he get famous for saying, I have a multi-bulleted list of policy proposals. I think the professionalization of not just government, but of advocacy, of movement speak, so both in the grassroots and in formal elected office, has meant that there's this notion that we need to sound like the adults in the room. We need to give very detailed policy and facts. And if we give facty facts, then people will realize that we're very serious and unimpeachable. When in fact, persuasion is fact neutral. You can have a deeply persuasive argument that is star-studded with facts, and you can have a persuasive argument that has few to none. But facts will actually never make your case. If you want people to come to your cause, you need to be attractive. And I actually think that while what you've outlined, the reliance upon facts, the reliance upon these really, really detailed arguments is a big part of the problem, an equally large part of the problem, and something that I spend a lot of time on, is our tendency to talk about our opposition in lieu of talking about what we're for.
Anat Shenker-Osorio, thank you very much for joining us once again, and please come back whenever you can.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.